conclusions have many different ways that they can be written. Conclusions are obviously a way that you conclude or pull together your essay, and there are actually many ways that you can write a conclusion that can be successful. So this presentation is going to address a few key types of styles that you could use for your conclusions, and we will end with a few short suggestions on what not to do. A conclusion typically does three things. It brings closure to the essay, it sums up your main points, and it provides a final perspective on your topic. And often conclusions help the writer to figure out exactly what their message was. And sometimes after I write my conclusion, I use it to guide me as I revise my essay, because sometimes as I write my conclusion, I see that I am concluding something, or my new ideas that I've incorporated into the conclusion may not actually have been addressed in the essay. And so writing a conclusion can be a really interesting experience from the point of view of a writer, because you can use the conclusion to see if what you concluded with is actually what you wrote about. And if it's not, it's a really great way to guide your revision process. So that's also something to keep in mind. So there are many types of conclusions. We're going to address just a few in this presentation, but there are certainly others. You don't need to feel limited to this list that's been created or the examples we're going to look at, but you certainly are welcome to try these. I would encourage you to. So some of the types of conclusions, and in addition to there being additional types of conclusions, some of these you might have two of these in one conclusion, and that's fine. Some conclusions respond to a so what question, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next slide. Others echo but don't repeat the introduction. That's a pretty common one, but it's common because it's quite successful. Some conclusions give suggestions for the future and offer a new meaning or a way to think about the topic. So the first one that we mentioned is answering the so what. And so that's where in your conclusion you would explain to your readers why your essay was meaningful and useful. And of course you've already done this in the writing, but by recapping it and reviewing it in the conclusion, your readers will have a more complete understanding of why what they just read mattered. So an example might be, some people say that Disney World is a consumer-centric waste of money, but my experience shows how going to Disney brought my family together in a way we had never experienced before. To me, Disney is more than just a place where Mickey Mouse lives. When you echo but do not repeat the introduction, you help to conclude the essay by reviewing the ideas and bringing the essay back to the starting part or point. This is a really common way, and it's probably the one that you're most familiar with, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. The reason you're familiar with it is because it's often very successful. So I pulled some really great examples from the St. Cloud University Literacy Education website because they were so good that I thought we should try them. So the introduction to the sample is, from the parking lot, I could see the towers of the castle of the Magic Kingdom standing stately against the blue sky. To the right, the tall peak of the Matterhorn rose even higher. From the left, I could hear the jungle sounds of Adventureland. As I entered the gate, Main Street stretched before me with its quaint shops, evoking an old-fashioned small town, so charming it could never have existed. I was entranced. Disneyland may have been built for children, but it brings out the child in adults. And then the conclusion. I thought I would spend a few hours at Disneyland, but here I was at 1 a.m., closing time, leaving the front gates with the now dark towers of the Magic Kingdom behind me. I could see tired children toddling along and struggling to keep their eyes open as best they could. Others slept in their parents' arms as we waited for the parking lot tram that would take us to our cars. My 40-year-old feet ached, and I felt a bit sad to think that in a couple of days I would be leaving California, my vacation over, to go back to my desk. But then I smiled to think, for at least a day, I felt 10 years old again. So what we see here is that the introduction brought us into Disneyland, right? We see it along with the author of this example. We see how as he or she arrives at Disney, they see that Disneyland might have been built for children, but it brings out the child in adults. You see that in the last sentence of that introduction. It's a pretty powerful line, right? Disneyland may have been built for children, but it brings out the child in adults. There's something in that it kind of resonates, even as somebody who personally doesn't like Disney at all. I see what they're saying here, and I'm interested to see where it's going. Now we see in the conclusion, in the very last line of the conclusion as well, that this author felt like they were a child again when they were at Disney. They really experienced or remembered what it was like to feel 10. So Disney did, for this author, bring out the child, even though he or she is an adult. So this echo but do not repeat the introduction is a really successful format. You can see here how it ties things together. It connects the introduction to the conclusion. It almost feels like it brings the whole piece of writing in a full circle back to where it started. So it also reminds us of why this person wrote about this topic, which they explain a bit in the intro. All right. Another example is to give suggestions for the future. So you might use the conclusion to make some suggestions about why this information will be important in the future, and that can help the reader to understand and apply the information they learned from your essay. You can use this style of conclusion to help the reader think about your topic in a new way. So an example would be, let's think about the Disney example from the previous slide. The author there might, instead of telling us about how Disney made them feel like a child, he or she could have talked about how going to Disney was such a great experience. And maybe that would make us as the reader start to think about how we might want to go to Disney, how we might take the personal experience that author shared and apply it to our own lives. Would maybe going to Disney be of interest to us after all? So when we do give suggestions for the future in the conclusion, we're trying to help the reader's thought process to apply what we wrote about to their own life. So that's another way that you can conclude. Some things to avoid when writing a conclusion. Try not to start off by saying in conclusion or in summary or in closing. We use those in verbal speech and it's perfectly fine, but in writing it seems really trite. It's very cliched. Another thing you want to try not to do is try not to introduce new ideas, which actually it goes along with the very last item on this slide, which is try not to integrate any additional research or evidence that you may have found but were unable to fit into the essay earlier. That's something that I think is pretty common. I know I'm guilty of it sometimes. I'll have made my argument, but then when I get to the very bottom, or the end, I'll want to add these 3 other facts that I have found that seem relevant but didn't fit in with anything else I wrote about. Try not to do that. You don't want to be introducing new ideas because you're trying to conclude, right? Conclude means to end. You're not trying to bring up new things to discuss. You're trying to pull everything you've already written about together. Another thing is try not to change the tone or incorporate emotional appeals, especially if your essay is written in an academic or analytical tone. So if you were writing about, let's go back to our Disney World or Disneyland example, if you were writing about the fiscal responsibility that Disneyland has to the community surrounding in California, you wouldn't suddenly want to start talking in your conclusion about something unrelated, such as how you went to Disney when you were 25 and it changed your life, because that's not actually relevant. So try not to, although there is always, I think, a tendency to want to incorporate a personal element, try not to incorporate that emotional information if it's not relevant to the entire essay, which it's usually not. And finally, try not to introduce the thesis in your conclusion. Sometimes it's nice to leave some suspense and have your reader more excited to read through, but your reader should certainly know what you're writing about by the conclusion. So your thesis really needs to come at the beginning. And finally, we have the works cited. Thank you very much. I hope that you learned a lot about writing conclusions.